Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to the start of our spring book chat series. We're pleased to host Nina Beguš, a research fellow at the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Science. Wait,
Society.
wait, Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. Thank you. Okay. Um, for a discussion of her recent book, Artificial Humanities, A Fictional Perspective on Language and AI. Hannes, is it Bajor? Bayor, Nina's colleague at the center and a faculty member in the Department of German, joins her for today's conversation. We have a busy schedule of events this spring, and we'll be sending out weekly updates, but I did want to draw your attention to a few things. First, in a couple of weeks in February, the Townsend Center will be holding a two-day symposium on the way we read now. Close, distant, embodied artificial modes of reading today was organized by Yael Segalovitz, a visiting professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Center for Jewish Studies. The symposium invites a number of scholars from Berkeley and elsewhere to reflect on the kinds of readers we're becoming at a moment in which AI and computational technologies increasingly serve as handmaiden to the act of reading itself. The event will take place on February 19th and 20th here in the Gabal Room, and of course, Nina and Hannes will be speaking at that event. This spring, we're delighted to host the literary scholar and theorist Hortense Spillers as our UNA's lecturer. Professor Spillers' lecture will take place on Tuesday, April 21st at BAM PFA's Osher Theater. We've planned a number of events as part of Spillers' residency, and we'll provide that information on our website and in our updates. Next Wednesday, February 4th, Jasper Burns, continuing lecturer in the Department of English, will be here to discuss his recent book, The Future of Revolution, Communist Prospects from the Paris Commune to the George Floyd Uprising. And he will be joined by Charmaine Chua, a professor in the Department of Geography. So that's all for now. Hannes and Nina, we're very excited for your conversation.
Thank you all for coming to the book chat. My name is Hannes Bayor. I'm in the German department, and I'm very pleased that I have the opportunity to speak to Beguš about the book Artificial Humanities, a fictional perspective on language and AI, which came out, I think, last fall with University of Michigan Press, with a beautiful cover with the artwork by the French artist Pierre. He's also, I think, involved. Nina is a trained comparist, but is currently, as Stephen said, a researcher at CPSFS. And as this remarkable book attests, she's one of the most important scholars in the intersection of fiction and artificial intelligence. And maybe I can start our chat with recalling a moment from the history of computing. In 1950, as you may know, Alan Turing published a paper that has since become famous for introducing the imitation game, what was later called the Turing test. If a computer could consistently convince human interlocutor that it itself was human, Turing argued, we would have good reason to call this computer intelligent. The Turing test then equates the ability to produce language with intelligence, treating one as the expression of the other. And although the test initially deals with written text, the implicit chain of reasoning seems to be whatever speaks is intelligent, and whatever is intelligent is human. At the end of this sequence, the human then becomes the measure of the computing machine, and the machine in turn the measure of the human. With current large language models, Turing's triple entanglement of language, reason, and the human still structures our present moment. At the same time, the LLM's capacity to write and increasingly to speak coherently, fluently, and convincingly is no longer a speculative test to be passed in the future. It's rather a reality for all of us to work on a day-to-day basis. And yet the disciplines most concerned with language, the humanities, had so far surprisingly little to contribute to this discussion. And this is, I think, where the book Artificial Humanities makes its intervention, calling our fields to engage with AI, with our expertise, but also in a constructive dialogue with the computer science and engineering discipline. Nina, maybe you can go right in here. You argue in your book that the Turing test can be read productively in a literary tradition that engaging with the ultimately the imaginaries of AI produce some kind of a productive confluence in this. And we'll focus on the Pygmalion myth from Egypt to George Bernard Shaw to Spike Jonze's Her. Maybe because that's the study of fiction tell us about how we think about artificial intelligence, and especially if Pygmalion's creation originally started out as news.
All right, there's a lot to unpack here. Just starting with the Pygmalion myth, which is such a bizarre myth of transformation, if you think about it, right? It's both a myth of creation and it's a myth of relation. So you have a man, always a man, creating an artificial human, always a woman. And then in the process of this creation, he falls in love with her. And there are some alterations of the myth. Sometimes the creator remains the father, and there's another character that becomes the lover. But there's always this creation plus relationality. And that's really what got me into AI 15 years ago, looking at how we actually create AI-based products with this relational aspect. Now, going to Turing and Shaw directly, there's a very strong connection between the two. We cannot really prove that Turing read or watched Pygmalion, but we know from his letters that he loved Shaw's plays. So there is some sort of influence already happening there. But even without this direct influence, you can see, looking at the play Pygmalion, you can see Eliza Doolittle being trained to speak like a human, a high-class English woman, not a Cockney flower girl. You can see her going through a series of the Turing tests, really, when she goes to perform in a setting among high-class English society to pass as one of them, to pass as human. So this idea of the Turing test is quite literally enacted in the play. Now, the way Turing imagined artificial intelligence is very important for the field of artificial intelligence as such, because he kind of set up the agenda, the research framework. He said, I see it as this childlike potential that is capable of learning and growing through education, and it's completely human-like. And this idea that you can build reason on the basis of language and thought. In this seminal paper, he starts, can machines think? And then right away jumps to language, equating thought and reason with language. And you can basically just, the way he sets up the Turing test, you can already see the gendered stray as well, very strong in the Pygmalion myth, also in the Turing test, because he says, okay, let's create a test. Imagine you're speaking to a man and to a woman, and you need to figure out whom you're speaking to. And now let's replace the woman with a computer, and this is what our test is going to be like. You'll be speaking to humans and to computers, and you'll need to figure out who are you speaking to. If the computer passes as human, they pass the test, right? It is really a theatrical performance of language. For Turing, he went with text. Eliza goes with speech, because speech, he knew that speech gives away too many identity markers for the machine to be capable of doing it. Text was much easier. And you can also see with him how the intelligence that he imagines is just functional. So the test is a functional performance of intelligence. It only matters how the computer does in comparison with the human. It doesn't matter if there's any meaning in what the computer is generating. It doesn't matter if the computer understands or knows what it's doing, and so on. And we can still see today, 75 years later, how we're still caught really in this modern ontology of what artificial intelligence is. I mean, just looking at the term artificial intelligence, it's really this human-like mind, human-like reason. And it's such a powerful metaphor that's really powering the whole, both technical and humanistic research.
I think what really struck me in the way that you set this up is that you really show to what degree the imaginaries of kind of the afterlife of Pygmalion come in a productive level, with AI. And I
Yes.
think you mentioned Eliza Doolittle, and there's this famous, what's called the first chatbot, Joseph Weizenbaum, Eliza. It is really kind of the intertext is palpable even in the production of AI.
Yeah. You can see the history going from Shaw to Weizenbaum's Eliza in 1966 to the chatbots we have now. And just this whole idea of, how we see AI metaphorically as an oracle, as a psychotherapist, as a teacher-student trope. There's a lot of literary tropes that are inscribed in the very technical creation of AI benchmarks, such as the Turing test, which was an important benchmark, the vinaigrette schema, the frame problem, the close benchmarks. All of these technical benchmarks are very much stories, literary, cultural tropes. And this is why I think literary studies in particular and language studies have so much to say about AI, because it was really centered around language from the very beginning. And we're still kind of there because it just so happened that the technical breakthrough happened with transformers and language models. But looking at the Pygmalion myth in relation to machines was very productive, because when you look at this relationship between Pygmalion, the creator, and the artificial woman, you can see how throughout centuries, the woman is getting more human attributes. It gets more agency. At the beginning, it has no name, then it gets the name, Galatea. With Rousseau, it speaks the first words right after her transformation. Then it takes another century for the artificial woman to be even able to speak in her own voice. You get with Anglophone women poets. You get in the second half of the 19th century, you get the Galatean perspective on this whole creation. Of course, Mary Shelley with Prometheus also does a lot for this transformation in the Pygmalion myth paradigm. And then with Eliza, we're in 1911 with Eliza Doolittle, and the artificial woman is still learning how to speak, still being taught how to speak properly. So you can see in the 20th century this intense conflation of artificial woman, which was in the 19th century in particular, it was more an artistic pursuit, either a painting, a statue. In the 20th century, the conflation with robotics takes place completely. It's now a machine.
Maybe I can pick this up. I mean, there's a strong feminist undercurrent in kind of your approach here, but it comes together with also an interest in post-humanism. And Haraway is someone you cite repeatedly, and Raidotti, which kind of are very much at the heart of this approach. Your post-humanism, however, is slightly different than theirs, right? You, in a way, argue that Pygmalionism is by necessity flawed somehow because it takes the human as a standard. And maybe you can tell us a little bit in what terms you argue this critique, and what are the problems of that identification?
Yeah, so for me, working as a literary scholar in the 2010s, I really looked back to Kate Hales, Donna Haraway, trying to find this post-humanist approach to how I can think about Pygmalionism, because it is so focused on the human, right? The artificial intelligence is basically human-like intelligence. The machines are built as if they have personas, right? You have Claude, who's a literary character. So all of that feeding into it made me question, is this really the only trajectory, this human-based trajectory that we could build the machines on? I think the centering the human is much more productive. First of all, because of the post-humanist critique that there's no single curated human image that we could build on, but also because, and that's a big argument in the book, that we should build machines not on this human potential, but on their own machinic potential. Look at the non-human ways that they could be productive. I think that's a much more honest, much less misleading approach to both understanding AI and to building it.
And now is the title of your book is Artificial Humanities, and you describe it as a research framework that may be adopted, that could be useful elsewhere. What does it exactly mean? And maybe you have some examples.
Yes. So the reason I was sort of forced to come up with a new term, because when I was working on my dissertation, digital humanities just didn't do it. People thought that, and I think digital humanities really did that back then. They used computational approaches for humanistic materials, whereas I was doing the other way around. I was using humanistic insights and knowledge for computational practices that were happening in real time. And I started talking to engineers already then, and I realized that we have all of this knowledge that they need but don't have. They themselves said, I have so many ethical questions to deal with when I'm working on autonomous vehicles. I was not equipped for this. So the book gained this more programmatic nature to it, where I say, you know, the fact that Silicon Valley acts as if there's no history, as Adrian Daub at Stanford argues in his book, is very much the case, right? But all these ideas have history, even the Turing test, as you can see, in fiction. So bringing that to technology making. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'll take it off. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so why the term? So that was kind of a way of going about it, because people kind of intuitively started to understand that it's about humanities and AI. But for me, it was really also, I wanted the term to be broad, because I didn't want this to just be my approach. I wanted it to be generative, no pun intended, experimental, interdisciplinary. I wanted to offer like this collaborative angle to our colleagues who are asking the very same questions, but were not equipped with humanities knowledge. And I thought, okay, humanities are really up for this challenge. We're the experts on language, we're the experts on fiction, and we're not talking about this enough, about all the unprecedented power of fiction that we see in tech spaces today, both, you know, in Silicon Valley, but also just with us users. We all inherit these fictional scripts that kind of inform how we imagine AI, which then further informs how we engage with it and how we build it. So this is why a new term, I think a lot of us in the humanities are still trying to figure out what good terms for this kind of study would be. Here at Berkeley, we're building a new department under the College of Computing, Data Science, and Society, and its tentative name is Human Technology Futures. It's for all humanities and interpretative social sciences scholars who focus on computing. With Schmidt Sciences, for example, they have this HAVI initiative. They call it Human and AI Technical Collaboration. Then you have critical AI, right, at Duke as a new journal. Again, its own angle, cultural analytics. So I feel like there's a lot of different subfields on how to approach this research question. Yeah.
And you mentioned collaborative research and interdisciplinarity. And I think what you try to do is to make the case that kind of we need to reach across the aisle. After all, AI is not simply a technical object, it's also a cultural technology. And I think that becomes more and more obvious. If I understand you correctly, you argue that one role of the humanities is to address, in a way, the blind spots of computer science, right? To prevent the repetition of familiar mistakes, to keep its imaginaries from remaining stuck in familiar ruts, from undoing this ahistoricity and so on. And in this sense, it sounds like the humanities can make a substantive contribution to the development of AI, right? And first, I want to ask, why do you think this is something worthwhile to pursue for the humanities? Right? And the second thing that's kind of follows up on that is, what do you think does AI bring to the humanities in turn? In other words, is there something that we as humanists can learn from that engagement about our own disciplines and maybe ways of working?
All right, so I'll go with the first question first. How can humanities really help in AI development? I think a lot of my research started from the frustration that I saw having, like, when it boils down to these questions, they are deeply humanistic, and the humanities really weren't there where things were being done. That was my frustration. So I argued that, yes, we should be involved with it. And there's basically two reasons. One is that the responsibility of developing AI is too big for technologists to bear it alone. And the second one is AI is a very qualitative technology. It's a very cultural, it's not just a technical artifact. And I can show you some examples, but I think also through my experience in the industry, right after my PhD, I started working at the Berkeley Institute, where they bring together technologists and thinkers and artists. And then we just started a startup and started consulting for other startups and big tech. And I saw how this knowledge is really needed. Now, the problem that many people see here is humanities as service, right? This is tricky with consulting because that's basically what it is. But there are other ways of going about it. I think what we see currently in 2026 with AI, and this is what makes the book still so current, and I think it will make it current for a while, is we just have this one form of LLMs that's subdued to the market. But I see a lot of different trajectories that AI could be developing into. And it's really lacking the philosophical dignity and agency. And I do think that our students have a lot to add. And once they enter these spaces, I mean, just think about all the social sciences students that were employed in tech industry, 15 years ago. I think the future for AI is really humanistic. And some CS departments already see that. I can see that in particular with a lot of CS PhD students who want to work on humanistic questions, and that's why they come to me as a collaborator. I think there's value in building the venues where we can talk to each other. I think it's an imperative, because the other option is being in the corner and not being involved with it. I don't think we should let the technology build the models for us that are then imposed on our research, on our teaching. The university can do much more. We're actually developing our own GAN models here, which don't require as much compute and cost, and I can show you a little bit. We're just publishing a paper on it. So there are many better options about going about it. Now, why is this interesting for the humanities? I think, so language is my focus, and language as a concept is in such space of tension right now. And looking at AI posing all these challenges to some of our very fundamental concepts, authorship, language, meaning, creativity, is a good way for us to revamp our criteria and to think about our concepts and how they are historically developing and how they are holding up. That's what I was doing with the book in particular, but there are a lot of other ways. So this paper is actually getting a lot of attention. I think it's because I put together both qualitative and quantitative approaches. And what's going on now at this point is really the models are becoming so good that you need more of qualitative approaches, which us in the humanities have been fostering for centuries. I also think that this cultural AI as a problem is such a colossal task that we really are equipped for. I wish that my own field of comparative literature would step up a bit, because we're probably the only field that has an insight into multiple languages and cultures and literatures. And you can see this global approach of AI just kind of creating this humongous cultural loop of, in our case, very Anglophone, very, Silicon Valley centric models. And this is the GAN model that we're publishing with this new journal.
I want to quickly say what a GAN is.
Oh, generative adversarial networks. This is a different kind of architecture. You probably know it from 10 years ago for pictures of fake cats. What we've done is we put speech in it, and you can actually access a lot of the, black box the latent space of the model with this interpretative way of going about speech, about language. We also, I see it doesn't work right now. Oh, well. We created a Finnegan, a model trained on Finnegan's Wake that you'll all be able to play with. This is already online. I mean, officially it's launching in a few days. But what I think is so good about this paper is you're actually able to engage with the models as a researcher, as a user, as, you know, experimentally. And then another project that really was my dream project from 2020, and it's very much in the spirit of artificial humanities, is engaging writers, people who live in a world of words, from the world of words, professional writers. What do they think about the entry of AI into the space of reading and writing? And so I gathered a couple of writers who already claimed their space in this discourse, and a couple of, well, you can see Hannes up there too, and our colleague Alex Pasquale, with just reflective essays and views on how to go about this, really. And I made sure there's a spectrum of views from people who, you know, 10 trillion things I hate about you, from a Netflix screenwriter, to people who are actually actively engaging with AI, such as Sasha Stiles, who's a language artist currently exhibiting in MoMA. So I'm excited for this book to come out in the fall. I think we're going to do another panel here at Townsend with local colleagues, Joe and Con. And yeah, there's a lot of things that are underway. I think some are just deeply humanistic, but get into technological spaces, such as this Eliza book from 1974 that was published only in Hebrew, but we're now publishing the original English conversations with Eliza from very, very early on. The chatbot was invented in 1966. So for all electronic literature people, that's a really big publication. And then there's a lot of, you can see pretty much work with my students and different task forces that we're doing on how to navigate AI in research, how to navigate teaching world languages, and what to think about the Midas myth in robotics, where it has very big presence with the Midas touch that Stuart Russell here at Berkeley called an ethical problem in robotics. Yeah, I guess we could go on with questions. There's a lot more to say, but I'd say really for artificial humanities, this is how I imagine it. It's focused on the humans, and particularly onto this relation with machines. And I'm working on some very zoomed in projects, such as our latent spaces, reading group and just exploratory research, where you look at what's happening within these models, how culture is being reproduced, what's getting fed as an output, input and output. And then I go to social relations, thinking about, okay, what will the society look like when we have 8 billion people and over 30 million users of replica and over 20 million users of character AI and so on. I mean, this is something that I think is easy to ignore, but it's such a profound Eliza effect that we have learned about in the 60s. And we learned also that we need to work with it because it's not going away. We are very relational to machines.
And just very quickly to say that character AI and replica are basically platforms that allow you to create an AI persona or an AI being you can then interact with, that can, I don't know, even be a companion, right? This, the idea of AI companionship also comes in there. And there again, you see the long history of
Yes. You know, even with Eliza, right, its main script was psychotherapist. And the fact that these companions, these virtual beings, are mostly being used as a support, mental health support, emotional support, sometimes financial support, is not a coincidence. But not a lot is really being done on this. And then, well, the planetary has its own space there because I'm working, since 2020, I've been working with Lawrence Berkeley Lab scientist, Owen Brody, where we basically look at AI from a zoomed out perspective, how does it fall into this long history of us humans in the biosphere inventing the technical part, right? How do we now fall into this long history on Earth where we have more digital data, where digital data will soon surpass DNA data and so on. So this is still in development, but yeah, that's probably time to go to questions.
Yeah, I think we can open the floor if there are questions, and there are many. There's a microphone going around. Maybe we can start here in the or there in the middle. Good, why not? Please, please.
I was intrigued by your subtitle, Fictional Approach to the Humanities, and because in many respects, I think the 19th century realism, the 19th century novel, passed the Turing test before there was ever a Turing test, right? You know, the way people read 19th century fiction until they get to university, at least, right, is to imagine that these people are real, right? This is real intelligence. And then as in scholarship, we've moved more towards, starting with, say, formalism, thinking about analyzing literature as a science, right? We've kind of created our own problem in terms of the inadequacy of these models that we used to accept. And so it seems to me that there's a basic problem. The basic problem may not be how do we adjust to technology now. It's the basic problem is losing that already successfully passing Turing test approach to literature that we've had in the 19th century. And so what worries me about discourse about we can't stay in our own corner, right, is that as we try to make Alexa more like Anna, in fact, Anna becomes more like Alexa, right? And that the 19th century novel, which was such a successful artificial intelligence in a way, is now being impoverished in part because people don't read it anymore, right? And so I think we can think spatially and metaphorically about our own little corner and it not being enough, right? But on the other hand, that corner, and I don't know that I accept the notion of a corner, right? But that corner is much richer, right, in so many ways than everything outside it. It's as though we were to leave the Jabal room and go out onto the campus and everything would be black and white. Right?
No, I think there was a misunderstanding about what I meant with the corner. I obviously think the humanities are worth doing and studying. I think when it comes to AI development, I don't want us to be left in the corner. I think we need to be there from the very beginning. Our students need to be there because in order to create a product that has more dignity and ethical agency, you cannot put a Band-Aid on it at the very end. We saw that doesn't work. You need to think about it from the very beginning as a process. So that's what I mean by it. I actually live with undergraduate students in Bowles Hall. And you know, one interesting thing that I mentioned already when we talked about AI and writing is, you know, I'm playing with Finnegan's Wake in the models. And my students learned about that and they organized a Finnegan's Wake reading, right? So there is this push towards analog that the humanities are offering, that our students are actually desperately wanting too. So yes, there are humanities on their own, and then there are humanities that are engaging with what AI is doing. I don't think you have to be engaging, but I do think there's a sort of minimally viable ethical response where you think about your own, like you intellectually think through what your own response is, even if that response is, I don't want to engage, because it's a sort of responsibility to others that we all hold. Now, what you were saying about the 19th century novel, it's actually, so my reader, who turned out to be Megan Ward, She was very early in thinking about AI in the 19th century novel. She wrote a book in 2018 looking at exactly that resonance between symbolic AI and the way 19th century novel developed. I have this Pygmalion-esque angle to it where you look at characters as artificial humans. And when you look at these different layers that happen also with Shaw, for example, he himself, there's a nice cover for the Broadway musical, The Vinyl, where you have Higgins holding Eliza as a marionette. And then you have Shaw above the clouds, godlike Shaw, holding Higgins as a marionette, right? This authorial approach to author as the creator that controls whatever the character can do. And I think in engineering, this is a little bit of a problem with machine learning because this control has been taken away. It's not industrial engineering anymore. It's a very different approach to how you create machines. You basically don't know what you've invented until you discover what it can do.
There was a question here in the first row.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Nina. That was so engaging. I have a couple of questions and pick and choose or neither. One is I'm just kind of curious. You got to it just a little bit in the beginning, but I would like to hear more about how you are in the book or just in general you were defining the AI in some sense, because that to me doesn't really feel the definitional work of AI has gotten extremely slippery, as we see on our drives to SFO or opening our computer, that in some sense like everything that's automated or everything that has, it's kind of a machine, like, so there's a kind of a marketing ploy, obviously, but I feel like, and then there's the, even outside of the marketing ploy, in both the defense or the decry of against AI, there's also like a definitional dearth that's also happening there, where maybe like there's an overwhelming weight given to LLMs, for instance, and not all artificial intelligence is LLMs, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to know how you are defining term. And then my second related question is the question of language. So even in this talk, it seems like there's a conflation or kind of a slippery that can be productive or not between language and humanities, right? And then that, like language, the human, and then the artificial and intelligence, those kind of like the three coordinates are moving. And I wonder just kind of like the status of language as such in what makes the intelligence, what you impute upon the machine to make it intelligent, or versus the language as being that which makes the human. So I guess, like, I mean, I have tremendous vested interest in this question, but the status of language in how all of the incredible work that you are doing is kind of figuring into that. I am not entirely, like, is language the end game, or is that actually kind of a red herring in some sense, that no matter how good of a poem a bot writes, we will not think of it as being a good poem if we know a bot wrote it, and like all sorts of other questions come up for that, right? And then finally, I feel like I'm so glad about, I mean, I'm on board with the question of like, we need to be there at the beginning for those of us who want to sign up for the assignment. But like, how are you thinking with the question of ethics in terms of just kind of at the planetary level of resources and fossil fuel, like all, like the actual material impact of what is deemed AI on the material world in which we are living in, you know?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great questions. So I'll go in order. The first one, I literally start the book by saying artificial intelligence is this umbrella term for a number of technologies. It is a marketing term, but it's also a research program that started with Turing, and then you know, other people from his colleagues from the Bletchley Park, like I.G. Good, they just continued that into the 70s. And you can see, and that goes into language and intelligence, you can see them really just following what Turing set up, saying, yes, a super intelligent machine will be a machine that will be able to communicate with us humans in human language. And this is a proof of intelligence. It might be able to do other kind of discoveries and communication that's not based in language, but we can only hope it will still communicate to us in natural human language, right? NLP, natural language processing, is literally a field that designates human language instilled in machines. I think this centrality of language in how we develop these technologies goes all the way back to modern ontology and thinking about language as constitutive of the human. And that's why I have this whole chapter on Pygmalionism and paralysis in medical ethics, because there you have neurotechnologies that help people speak. That's also AI. So I talk about chatbots, I talk about social robots, I talk about LLMs, and about neurotechnologies where you have implants or helmets that help people communicate from brain to speech. And this is all very cutting edge technology that's usually just being labeled as AI. Now, your third question, this is why I think the work that I'm doing it with Owen is important. Owen is a microbiologist that leads a nerd system science lab, and he really gets all this. Although he comes from a biological perspective, really, but in his lab, he's using all of these technologies to be able to study climate change and so on, just the way Earth systems adjust. And what we're trying to do is really look at this planetary perspective where you don't work in this industrial machinic way against nature, but you work with nature. You work with the capacities that are rendered by the planet. So there are, I guess, two major bottlenecks. One of them is the exploitation of resources, how energy hungry AI is, right? This is really a problem that we need to solve as fast as possible. And the way we look at it is in this series of innovations, right? You need to find, when you get to a bottleneck, when you get to a constraint, you need to find a better way of doing things in order to overcome it. And I kind of have, I guess in all my work, I have this optimistic view because I believe in the human spirit. I believe in our ability to solve problems and then create new ones. But in our ability to figure out what's wrong, to identify the problem and then solve it together. This is why I think collaboration is so important for AI in particular.
I think we would have time for one more question if there are any. Yeah, over here.
Thank you for your talk. My question is quite simple. It seems to me that a lot of the way that models write, especially frontier models, is somehow derivative with the M dashes and it's not this, it's that. It feels like there are a lot of repetitive patterns and that these are common across all the frontier models. So what do you think motivates this convergence where there isn't one that is obviously better at writing than the others? And what do you think they're missing that is necessary for good writing?
Well, going back to language, they are missing everything that we have. Existential subjectivity, human creativity that we find valuable. I think these models are interesting, potentially interesting, because they can create something novel with language that maybe us humans wouldn't do, but maybe we won't even recognize it as productive. For me, it's really, can these models take us somewhere where we otherwise wouldn't be able to go? Now, the reason why these flagship models are very non-creative and we have this cliche project, oh, maybe I didn't put it on. Oh, it's here, it's the third one. We've been trying to see how you break off this cliche way of writing that annoys us all so much, right? Cliche at some point was novel, but then it wears out and then you get that slop and you get the cringe, right? I think the dichotomy, the way we go about the models, it's kind of getting funny because literature has been there from the very start, right? Turing talks about sonnets. he says, I don't see why AI couldn't write sonnets or do anything else that humans can do. But at the same time, when he develops the Turing test, he says, oh, if you want to make sure you're talking to a machine, just ask it to write you a poem, and it will say, oh, I can't do that. So now we actually have in our volume, we have Annelies Gelman. She's a poet who tested Claude in poetry generation. And she said, Claude is a good poet. It could create poetry that's on par with human poetry. But where does that really lead us? I think this tendency that we see from the very beginning, even when language models came out, people really wanted to use them for creative writing. And now a lot of people are actually going back to GPT-2 because it was less aligned and, you know, supposedly more creative and fun to work with. I just hope that we won't be stuck in this single marketable model. And especially with artists, with visual artists, you can already see it. I hope we'll step out and find novel ways of tinkering with AI that actually are creative. But LLMs are not quite it. Although, here I have Hannes, right? He's written a whole novel with what was your tool actually?
GPT Neo-X was
Yeah.
a kind of smaller model.
Yeah, so I think there's also something interesting for us humanities people to examine, and this is what Hannes is doing, looking at how this linguistic ability is skewed, really, is rendered in a completely new way in machinic writing. I think seeing what's happening with language when it's out of our hands, and it is inherently interesting for us humanities people.
And I think it's also an interesting opportunity to look at what good writing is,
Yeah.
and where the standards of writing come from, especially if you don't have a kind of more middle of the road approach to literature, but come from an experimental lineage. I think we have time for one more question if there is one. It's in the front.
Are you familiar with?
No, there's a microphone coming in.
Are you familiar with the film Clara and the Sun?
Oh, I didn't see the film, but I read the novel.
Yes, so it hasn't come up. So I'm very curious. As you said, you generated, it's my understanding, you generated a novel.
It was a co-writing project, yes.
I'm very interested as an editor who does books for films. This is a very co-creative process. When you're speaking about the possibility.
No, I'm not going there. No. It's just a planetary perspective. So I'm looking at AI from all these different scales and how this new kind of machinic tool actually uses basically entropy, thermodynamics for its advances. I'm not working with planetary consciousness in this stream of, humanistic thought that has been established. No. Although I guess there is some connection with the Gaia hypothesis and, the way they, I guess it's a historical precedent to this thinking.
I'm just fascinated with the work you're doing with humanities in tradition, but also as authors are creating work and co-creating the incredible role that the technology can play, co-creating, generating, expanding what's even possible, because when those books and films come into the collective, they're also even imagining an iteration of what the future can be. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I be short? Okay, two things. Well, now they're both gone. So, okay, about writing. I think there is a really interesting aspect of, when we launched this book, I got James Hugh of Pseudowrite, one of our authors, and Ted Chiang, who calls everything that AI generates plagiarism, right? It completely he's like, he said it doesn't fit into the way we established authorship. Then I asked, what do you do with this figure of a literary author chained to a desk, observing the world and writing their thoughts into it? And they say, oh, that's never been the case. We always talk to each other. We always search for feedback. And then James said, well, this is basically what I'm offering in a company. The authors come for feedback, and sometimes we could also create a community. And I think now I'm working with another startup, Othelia, where they are offering their services to screenwriters who have always worked as a group. They have the writer's room, right? So putting AI into that room, I think, is not really quite happening. I would be curious what's going on. I'm trying to push them into that group direction, but it's not, we're still not there. I think what's original about them is that they are not generating a whole bunch of text the way we're used to when you have to comb through it. They're trying to help authors' decisions and intent during the process of creation. So one thing AI is really good at is this Borgesian, we look at different paths. I kill this character, what happens? Or I change this locale, what happens? What are the trajectories? This calculative brute force could be used. But it's honestly, that hasn't been the case so far. That's why I guess I'm disappointed with what we have in 2026. But I think better things are coming along.
We have to stop here. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you all for coming, and come next time.
Thank you, Fanny.